Welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, April the 30th, 2021. My name is Pam. Our first article, CSI Houston, How a Texas Lab Has Remade the Science of Forensics, by Henry Gass. Houston. We don't know who the woman was, but we know she was sitting in the pickup truck when the burglary went south. We know it was a September afternoon in 1977 when Cornelia and Ivan Stout returned home to find the truck in their driveway. We know the burglary soon turned into a murder. Miss Stout was beaten unconscious and her husband beaten to death with his own .22 caliber rifle, almost certainly by Kenneth Felder, who was shot and killed later that night and had Mr. Stout's wallet in his pocket. But here the truth gets murky. Who was the woman in the pickup truck? Police found a couple of fingerprints on the truck. Prints, they said, belonged to Sherry Ann Porter. A jury believed them and convicted her of murder. Ms. Porter may never have been there at all. After 4 years in prison, her conviction was overturned due to insufficient evidence. A couple of fingerprints were not enough. To this day, it's unclear if justice in the case has been served or denied. Those decades of uncertainty and trauma might have driven the victim's grandson to become a cop or a prosecutor, but Peter Stout couldn't stop thinking about those fingerprints. He became a forensic scientist. It weighed on me having had a family that may have been complicit or participatory in a wrongful conviction, says Dr. Stout. All of that revolved around forensic evidence. His life has been defined by a quixotic search to bring scientific truth to the justice system, a search that has led him to the cutting edge of criminal justice reform, heading what some call the nation's most advanced and innovative crime lab, the Houston Forensic Science Center, or the HFSC. Forensic science is a civilizing force, Dr. Stout believes, because nothing can deliver truth, fairness, and equity to the criminal justice system better than the hard evidence crime labs that can unearth and verify. He sees the criminal justice system as a complex quagmire so rife with human error, he isn't surprised that 9 in 10 Americans want it reformed. In that quagmire, he says, are kernels of hard truth, and in forensic science, he sees the best hope of finding them. It can offer a just result, he said, something that actually is fair, even-handed, and reflects as close as you can understand the actual truth. Forensic science failed Dr. Stout in his grandfather's case. It compounded his uncertainty about other brushes with violence he says he experienced early in his life, from an improbable mafia war in his middle-class Denver neighborhood to his years-long sexual abuse by a neighbor. A violent act, Dr. Stout knows better than most, can echo for generations, far beyond just the victim and perpetrator. But while he's emerged with a successful and comfortable life, he doesn't want forensic science failing anyone else. Unashamedly nerdy. In a quiet corner office at HFSC, Dr. Stout does the numbers. Through the window, downtown Houston sprawls around him, a bottomless pit of casework. The lab produces about 100 reports every day, and each report is about a crime. Each crime touches about 20 people, he estimates, so that's about 2,000 lives the lab affects each day. Across a year, we alter hundreds of thousands of people's lives, he said. The ongoing impact of that is the difference of whether civilization becomes more civilized or not. Popular culture has long portrayed the world of forensic science as technologically sleek, staffed by bespectacled scientists in lab coats, ingeniously analyzing evidence and almost never making mistakes. In reality, despite the existential stakes, many of these laboratories have lacked proper accreditation and oversight, been staffed by overworked, underfunded, and underqualified analysts, and been mired in scandal. And all this has contributed to cases where the innocent people were convicted and guilty people walked away. The Houston Police Department, or the HPD, had one such lab, consumed by years of mismanagement, neglect, and corruption, out of which grew the reform effort that is the HFSC. The current lab is an unusually well-insulated, well-oiled, and well-funded machine compared with its predecessor, and Dr. Stout is an atypical public face for criminal justice reform. One moment he can reflect somberly through his own traumas about the consequences of underinvesting in forensic science. The next, he's cracking a toothy smile, joking about his baldness or geeking out like a boy in a macabre high-tech toy store, unashamedly nerdy. Indeed, HFSC represents a nerdy brand of criminal justice reform, filled with jargon, acronyms, and huge implications. Scientific evidence is disproportionately persuasive evidence, and in that disproportionate power comes an awful lot of responsibility, says Dr. Stout. I'm not sure we've done a particularly good job historically of treating it appropriately. That may now be changing. Turning around one lab doesn't turn around an entire justice system. He knows. But it's a good start to a long journey. The lab now operates independently outside of and on an equal footing with police, prosecutors, and other players in Houston's justice system. The 2008-person staff, 3/4 of which is female with an average age of 32, works out of 4 floors and a few basement rooms in a glass and concrete tower shared with the district attorney's office. It's about $30 million budget funds, a full-service laboratory with sections for toxicology, DNA, firearms, and latent prints, among other disciplines. And besides processing evidence for America's 4th largest city, HFSC has produced innovations, big and small. They are setting industry standards. It's working with academics and publishing research to improve the validity and reliability of forensic disciplines. It's a global leader on quality control, the practice of detecting mistakes and ensuring they don't happen again. The Houston lab is really doing something special and unique. It's almost a unicorn among crime labs, says Jessica Gable-Sino, a professor at Georgia State University College of Law. In many respects, HFSC is an outlier among the country's roughly 400 crime labs. Most remain inside law enforcement agencies with constrained budgets and staff, yet they all produce evidence and testimony that are disproportionately persuasive because they come from the presumably precise and hermetically sealed world of forensic science. The CSI problem. Concentrate on what cannot lie, the evidence. With that simple statement in the pilot episode of CSI Crime Scene Investigation, lead character Gil Grissom voices perhaps the greatest myth about forensic science. It's certainty. For decades, forensic science has been held up and has held itself up as nearly infallible. Did this hair come from that head or this bullet from that gun? The crime lab would know. But did they? Certainly crumbled in 2009 with the seismic conclusion of a National Academy of Sciences report when it came to matching evidence from a crime to a specific individual or source. No forensic method besides nuclear DNA analysis has the capacity to consistently and with a high degree of certainty make those matching claims. Decades of scientific evidence being overstated or misrepresented, intentionally or otherwise, has had devastating consequences. Since 1989, bad forensic science has contributed to a quarter of 2,700 plus exonerations nationwide, according to the National Registry of Exonerations. Tens of thousands of cases have been found to be tainted by faulty forensic analysis or testimony. We've made assumptions and given latitude to less than rigorous work, says Dr. Stout. It's part of why people don't trust the justice system. The kicker is that no forensic discipline may ever be 100% reliable, but compared with non-scientific forms of evidence, such as eyewitness testimony, which is now widely questioned, forensics is closer to being that kernel of truth, he says. That uncertainty should in fact be comforting, he adds. We are wickedly prone to believing absolute statements, he continues, Evidence that should carry much more weight comes with that hard but very necessary conversation about its limitations. Ultimately, reforming forensic science needs both practical and cultural shifts from improving standards and procedures to embracing uncertainty and limitations. Analysts being clear about what they know and don't know is especially critical given the weight juries give scientific evidence. We have to take the responsibility to produce forensic evidence as rigorously as we can, says Dr. Stout, because the number of trials that swing on one piece of physical evidence is really terrifying. Beyond the yellow tape, the body has been in the dumpster for a few hours at least, maybe a dozen. It's a male and he was shot, maybe in the head. The dumpster sits under a warm, overcast February sky behind a brutalist strip mall in an industrial corner of Houston's west side. The buzz of highway traffic fills the air. 2 Houston police detectives in shirts and ties orbit the dumpster, which is cordoned off by yellow tape. They pause every few minutes to study some new detail or jot down notes. A dumpster is a logical place to dispose of a body, but maybe not in front of the store surveillance camera trained on it. After reviewing the footage with a police detective, investigators from HFFC's crime scene unit put up a narrower cordon of red tape. Of all the reforms HFSC is cultivating, the red tape is a small but significant one. It marks the most sensitive area of the crime scene. You can't cross it unless you're in full protective gear. It's a product of the CSU becoming fully civilized, not staffed by police officers like it was in the past, and like many CSUs still are. Crime scenes are where investigations start. It's where the first mistakes can be made and where the first biases can take root. Having a civilian CSU on scene has let confidence and trust permeate the justice system, says Stacy Mitchell, chair of the HFC Board of Directors. In the past, we've had officers investigating officer-involved shootings, she adds, because we have civilianized crime scene investigators who are specially trained. Now everyone is confident that the evidence is the evidence. Forensic information travels through a long, meticulous chain of custody, however, and a more secure and expertly managed crime scene doesn't eliminate the possibility of mistakes down the line, which is why HFFC's most lauded reform has nothing to do with the collection or testing of actual evidence. It's the testing of the lab itself. Faking evidence with purpose. Last year, to verify what the Forensic Biology Division was doing, an HFSC analyst needed some fake evidence, uncontaminated female DNA to be precise. So she lifted her hair, swabbed the back of her neck, and sealed it like genuine crime scene evidence in a container to send to the lab. A well-functioning research facility with well-trained staff would be expected to analyze it and only find female DNA. So when the final analysis revealed a mix of female and male DNA, the analyst had to investigate. The male DNA ended up being from the husband of the analyst who swabbed her neck. The first of 3 cases that year of HFSC accidentally contaminated its own blind test. Dr. Stout is now considering publishing a paper about how to teach DNA analysis analysts around the country how easy it can be to contaminate samples. If HFSC has a crown jewel, it's the 7-person and all-female quality division. And if the lab has a standout innovation, it's the division's blind testing program. Each year, lab scientists create hundreds of pieces of fake evidence or meticulously fill burner phones with false content like apps, social media posts, and texts to probe for flaws in how the lab is functioning. Of the 25,000 requests the lab completes each year, about 5% are blind tests. That's a ratio handpicked by Dr. Stout, frequent enough that analysts expect them, infrequent enough to be hard to predict. Other labs may do a handful a year, and most don't do this at all. The constant surveillance could make for a toxic workplace, but Dr. Stout and the lab's department heads make it a friendly cat and mouse game throughout HFSC. Analysts who identify a blind test win a Starbucks gift card. Those who don't owe Dr. Stout $1. More importantly, the lab has normalized a workplace culture that sees mistakes as inevitable and as opportunities to improve, not punish. Without that quality check, your answer, even though you have it, isn't necessarily the right answer, says Erica Zymak, director of the Quality Division. Part of what we do every day is making sure that we are, as Dr. Stout says, the right answer at the right time. Independence Days. But for the foundation of it all is the parity HFSC enjoys in Houston's justice system. Independence from law enforcement was key to the city's creation of HFSC in 2014. But in spinning off HPD's crime lab and CSU to form the center, Houston officials went even further, giving HFSC a corporate quasi-governmental structure. Dr. Stout's official title is President and Chief Executive Officer, and he reports to a diverse 9-member board of directors of scientists, lawyers, police, and those who wrongfully convicted. The board reports to local government the way police and prosecutors do, making their own personnel decisions and budget requests. The result is not only that a scientist rather than a law enforcement officer is in charge, but also that the facility has a bigger budget with a larger, higher paid, better equipped staff than most crime labs. And there's less bureaucracy. Dr. Stout can tinker himself with a new gadget, a drone, to help CSU digitally map crime scenes, which in turn reduces time on site so they can respond to more than the meager 1% of aggravated assaults they got to last year. And he can provide suitable mental health support for staff members who are exposed daily to the unfiltered horrors of the society. Tucked away in a police department, the lab might not be a very high priority, says Sandra Thompson, a professor at the University of Houston Law Center who spent 7 years on HFSC's board. The old HPD crime lab wasn't just tucked away, it was getting rained on. We were stuck in a closet like mushrooms. Nobody ever looked at us, says James Miller, whose 31-year career straddled the old lab and the new, where he heads the seized drug division. A leaky roof went unfixed for years, soaking and destroying evidence. The backlog of untested rape kits hit 6,600 at one point, with one victim waiting 5 years to have hers tested. Senior positions went unfilled, and when misconduct was discovered, punishment was usually lenient. An independent investigation of the HPD lab uncovered 4 cases between 1998 and 2000 of dry labbing, or a fabrication of or tampering with evidence, a cardinal sin for scientists. In 2003, the New York Times asked if the HPD crime lab was the worst in the country, or if, more troubling, it was typical. Evidence since then suggests it wasn't unusual. The biggest scandal of them all is still unfolding in Massachusetts, where tens of thousands of criminal charges have been dropped because of misconduct by 2 former state chemists 8 years ago. St. Paul, Minnesota closed its crime lab in 2012 after investigations found major errors in nearly every aspect of the lab's work. In 2015, the FBI admitted to presenting flawed testimony on hair fiber comparisons in court for decades. But as bad as the intentional misconduct is, systemic flaws, underfunding, and lack of oversight and standards are bigger problems, experts say. Reform on that scale takes time, Dr. Stout knows, but he points to the HPD lab. It's the archetype of the failed laboratory, and it was fixed. It's not easy, but you can actually make a difference, he adds. You can get to a point where people begin to start trusting what comes out of labs again. Light in the darkness. Dr. Stout still doesn't have an elevator pitch for a politician on the importance of forensic science. It's just too Byzantine. But if he could take the stairs with a government official, he'd probably talk about his own journey. They would have to walk up the 18 flights to HFSC's top floor. slowly. What happened with his grandfather and Ms. Porter changed his life forever. But he'd already had more exposure to violence than any of your average preteens. A neighbor was gunned down in a mob hit when he was 3 years old, an age where you might think you imagined something like that. For a long time, Dr. Stout did. That mafia war in his Denver suburb did happen, but much of his younger years after his grandfather's murder remained writhed in darkness. His family had all retreated into private shells of grief. No one was really looking out for him, he says, and for several years a neighborhood boy sexually assaulted him. He doesn't remember much, in part because he doesn't want to. But as he's grown older, as his forensic science career has progressed, he said he's begun to see through the darkness with a bit more clarity. It's made him think about trauma and how it changes memories and lives. It's made him think differently about those fingerprints on that truck in 1977. He won't ever know if Miss Porter was in that truck, and he may never want to shine a light on every dark trauma in his past. But now he hopes that the forensic science lab he runs can provide a clarity he never enjoyed. I keep having to come back to look for those little crystalline facts to try and ground my fractured and fragmented memories, he says. I get a lot of assurance out of those facts, and I think what that has led me to is others have to have the same thing. Up next, Afghanistan welcomes home looted art despite concerns about the Taliban. Afghanistan is welcoming the return of ancient artwork recovered from a smuggler in the U.S., but shadows of the Taliban destruction of art lingers. By Ben Fox, Associated Press. Washington. Precious relics of Afghanistan's ancient past are returning home as the nation confronts deepening uncertainty about its future. A collection of 33 artifacts seized from New York-based art dealer, who authorities say was one of the world's most prolific smugglers of antiquities, was turned over by the United States to the government of Afghanistan this week. The significance of the material is huge. Roya Hermani, the country's ambassador to the U.S., said Wednesday. Each one of these pieces are priceless depictions of our history. Ms. Rahmani formally took control of the collection in a ceremony Monday in New York with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and Homeland Security investigations, which recovered the artifacts as part of a large investigation into the trafficking of antiquities from a number of countries. Now, after briefly being displayed at the embassy in Washington, the masks, sculptures, and other items, some from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, are en route to Kabul, where they are expected to go on display at the National Museum. It's the same museum where members of the Taliban destroyed numerous artifacts in 2001 as part of a cultural rampage rooted in its fundamentalist version of Islam, in which depictions of the human form are considered offensive. The Taliban is now out of power, but it controls much of the country outside of Kabul amid stalled talks with the government and the looming withdrawals of U.S. and NATO forces after 2 decades of war. Ms. Rahmani concedes it's a delicate time. However, what I know is that our security forces are determined to defend our people, she says in an interview with the Associated Press. The government is committed to doing its part for peace and stability in a way that would bring durable peace. They may get a chance earlier than expected. Germany's defense minister said Wednesday that discussions are underway among military planners with the NATO-led Resolute Support mission in Kabul for a possible withdrawal of international troops from Afghanistan as early as July 4th. President Joe Biden has already said the U.S. would remove all its troops by September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the attacks that prompted the American invasion to dislodge the Taliban in 2001 for allowing al-Qaeda to operate from Afghanistan. Before the September 11 attacks, the Taliban had already become internationally notorious for enforcing a harsh form of Islamic law that kept women out of public view and for destroying, with rockets, shells, and dynamite, the famed giant 6th century sandstone Buddha statues built into a cliff in the Bamiyan province. The destruction of the statues was on the ambassador's mind as she prepared to ship the artifacts to her homeland, and not only because a mural of the sandstone Buddhas adorns the room at the embassy where visitors gathered this week to see the relics. Miss Ramani, her country's first female ambassador to the U.S., recalls that she wept when she first learned what the Taliban had done to the Buddhas. It was an important moment, she says, because she had pledged never to let anyone see her cry, as a way to defy the male dominated culture of her homeland. I broke my vow, she said. I really cried hard. I wept and wept. In contrast, these looted antiquities are returning to a government and people who cherish their past and will make sure they are preserved for future generations, Miss Ramani said. She doesn't expect the Taliban, if they return to power, would dare to destroy them. Our security forces and our government would not let that happen, she said. We are determined not to let that happen. Like the statues, some of the recovered antiquities depict Buddha. There's also a marble statue of Shiva and a Greek mask. The artifacts reflect the multicultural influences on Afghanistan, an important center of trade and commerce, according to Frederick Hebert, an archaeologist and National Geographic Fellow who studies the country. There are at least 2,600 archaeological sites around the country, says Mr. Hebert, who helped authenticate some of the items after they had been confiscated by federal agents, and discussed the relics at a gathering Tuesday at the embassy. Afghanistan is one of the richest countries in archaeology and history in the world, he said, and there's a very good reason, of course. For 6,000 years, there's been civilization based in Afghanistan. That also makes it an attractive target to looters, which is how the items eventually ended up in the U.S. In 2007, Homeland Security Investigations, an agency that deals with cases of smuggling that traverse international borders, received information about looted artifacts brought to the New York City area from India. It eventually led to the indictment of a New York art gallery owner, Subhash Kapoor, and 7 others, as well as the seizure of more than 2,600 artifacts valued at more than $140 million. He is jailed in India on charges and faces extradition to the U.S. when that case is resolved. In the meantime, the U.S. government is working to repatriate the looted material, much of which was found in a series of raids on storage units in the New York City area. They have already returned relics to Nepal and Sri Lanka, and soon will turn over artifacts to Thailand, says Stephen Lee, the supervisor special agent in charge of HSI's Cultural Property, Arts, and Antiquities Unit. The 33 items being sent to Afghanistan, valued at around $1.8 million, are the first to go back there as part of this investigation. They belong to the people of Afghanistan, Mr. Lee said. That's their cultural history. Up next, in Maine, a small secondhand bookstore soldiers on by Robert Close. The Dutch Renaissance humanist Esramus of Rotterdam once wrote, "When I have a little money, I buy books, and if I have any left, I buy food and clothes." Though this came to mind as I drove through one of Bangor, Maine's poorest neighborhoods en route to a small, offbeat second-hand bookstore that distinguishes an otherwise careworn street and bears the lofty moniker Pro Libris Books, a practical person might ponder what essential service a bookstore provides to an impoverished neighborhood, which raises the question of what one considers essential. What a wonderful, wonderful thing to have a bookstore in one's midst, especially in a place where other needs may incessantly intercede in an electronic age where so many bookstores, whether of the small independent mom and pop variety or the mega outfits like Borders, have evaporated from our communities seemingly overnight. Pro Libris Books is an unassuming but well-ordered cave of a shop occupying the ground floor of a peeling paint clapboard building. Its facade is adorned with a hand-lettered sign, its entrance flanked by a funky plastic chair in the form of a hand. The owner, Eric Fury, is there a more appealing name for a bookseller, has plied his trade since 1980 and happily still turns a profit. Mr. Furia, a small septuagenarian with an outsized crop of salt and pepper hair, touts his business as a reader's paradise. This seems to be enough to attract a rich variety of types I have observed there: high professionals, children, loquacious bookworms, students, college professors, and even, reflecting the neighborhood, a fair share of huddled masses yearning to read free. When I asked Mr. Furia if anyone notable had ever visited his shop, he quietly divulged appearances by authors Stephen King, William Kotzwinkle, Lynn Fellwelling, and Allen Ginsberg, but said this with reticence, as if unwilling to rank his clientele. As I wandered the stacks, dividing my time between titles and observing the other visitors, I noted the interplay between patron and proprietor. Not everyone's there to buy. If I'm not mistaken in my interpretation of body language, my impression is that many are there to be, and I choose this word carefully, comforted. The familiar titles, the affordability of the volumes, the quirky touches, a coffin-turned bookcase from the set of Stephen King movie, a bumper sticker announcing, "Maybe the hokey pokey is what it's all about, Mr. Fury's roaming cat," return me to the considerations of what we need, of what is indeed essential. When I am visiting Pro Libris books, I find myself siding with celebrated author John Updike, who once said, "Bookstores are lonely fonts spilling light onto the sidewalk. They civilize their neighborhood." I think Mr. Fury would agree, as would his customers. When I broached the topic of necessity with him, he recalls a woman who gave him a $20 bill for a $9.50 sale and told him to keep the change, remarking, "I just don't want you to ever go away." And then there was the man who sent him $80 out of the blue because he was worried about how Mr. Fury was faring during the pandemic-induced lockdown. I asked him about his survival secret. The answer: low overhead and loyal clientele. The neighborhood might profit from, say, a supermarket, but the presence of Pro Libris books and the community it serves is evidence that man or woman or child does not live by bread alone, and that it is important to go on caring, even and perhaps especially in parlous and uncertain times. Well, friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, April 30th. My name is Pam. Thank you for having me into your home today, and please stay safe until we meet here again. And above all, I wish you abundant blessings.